Chapter 71. Troublesome Brother. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Chapter 71. Troublesome Brother. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Du Yuanrua cried and shouted for his mother after being beaten up by Du Yuanyi. Unfortunately, this wasn't the Duke's estate in the capital. His mother wasn't around, and there was only his brother, who had always been strict towards him. When he saw Du Yuanrua's miserable state, the anger Du Yuanyi felt on the way here was finally relieved. He put down his rolled-up sleeves, turned around, and slowly walked to the chair at the side to sit down. He glanced at Du Yuanrua, who was still crying on the ground, with a disgusted expression. "Why are you crying? How dare you cry? Go tidy yourself up and get your butt over here. I have something to ask you." Du Yuanrua didn't dare to delay. With the help of a few servants, he got up from the ground and was helped out. After he went out to wash up and change his clothes, when he returned, the servants who had come with him were on the ground. "Envied, you had quite a good time this time." Du Yuanyi shook the stack of accounts in his hand in anger. Du Yuanrua subconsciously covered his head and kneeled on the ground. It was obvious that this wasn't the first time he had done so. It was done with familiarity. Along the way, they had only passed through a few cities, but this brat had already used 30 to 40,000 taels. Not only did he squander money on drinking and gambling, but he even had a courtesan. If not for the fact that he had arranged for someone to come and clean up the mess, he would have already transported the courtesan back to the capital. Under everyone's watch, on one side, Pei Qian had handled everything well. On the other side, before Du Yuanrua even finished his task, a courtesan had already been sent to the capital. Fortunately, he didn't succeed. If he really succeeded, he would have become a laughing stock. "Get up and answer me." Du Yuanyi looked at Du Yuanrua, who was hugging his head and trembling on the ground. He silently repeated the words, "He's my biological brother," dozens of times in his mind before barely suppressing his anger. "Tell me, what happened during this period? Didn't they say that you had the plague? From the looks of it, you don't look like you've suffered at all." Du Yuanyi raised his hand and pointed at the seat not far from him, indicating for Du Yuanrua to sit down. Now wasn't the time to worry about his younger brother being a good for nothing. Anyway, it was already an open secret that his younger brother was a good for nothing. The most important thing now was to figure out the situation in the refugee camp. Although he couldn't get anything important out of this good for nothing, he still had to ask. "It's all because of that bastard Pei Qian." It would have been fine if Du Yuanyi hadn't mentioned the plague, but this was Du Yuanrua's sore spot. As soon as he mentioned it, tears flowed down his face. Facing his brother, he had no scruples. With anger, grievance, and resentment, he told Du Yuanyi everything that had happened after he met up with Pei Qian. Of course, regarding the details related to him, he had to euphemize things. If he really couldn't think of any way to euphemize things, he wouldn't mention it. In short, he made himself seem like the aggrieved underdog, while he made Pei Qian seem like the bully who had almost taken his life. Du Yuanrua had planned things out very well. He probably wouldn't be able to defeat that lunatic, Pei Qian, in this lifetime. But didn't he have an older brother? Now that his brother was around, Pei Qian was useless. So, when the plague was spreading, you wanted to return to the capital. Du Yuanyi looked at his younger brother, who was still immersed in his grievance. After a long time, he asked about the details Du Yuanrua had mentioned in his contradictory story. "No, but what else could I have done but return to the capital? At that time, our refugee camp encountered the plague. What else could I have done?" Du Yuanrua slapped his thigh. Although he sensed that something was wrong and revealed a hint of guilt, he quickly raised his voice and said confidently. Although his excuse was reasonable, what if? How difficult can it be to find another group of refugees in the empire? If you guys hadn't quickly ended the plague at that time, what if there had been no way to treat it? Wouldn't the consequences be uncontrollable? It's called taking precautions. Yes. I heard this term from you previously. This is the correct term. You're saying that the person who entered the plague area to save people was a country girl doctor. Du Yuanyi lowered his eyes and mentally repeated his previous words a few times before slowly raising his head to continue asking. Yes, a woman. TSK. She's from the countryside. Not only does she look ordinary, but she's also married. Perhaps because he saw that his elder brother's attitude was quite good at this moment, Du Yuanrua started to badmouth people again. I really couldn't tell that Pei Qian liked that type of woman. Speaking of which, that dim-witted hunter is quite unlucky. After hunting for his entire life, he actually doesn't know that he's been cuckolded. Ouch. The more Du Yuanrua spoke, the more ridiculous his words became. Before he could finish commenting, he was kicked by Du Yuanyi. At this moment, Du Yuanyi couldn't even suppress his anger. What kind of nonsense was this little bastard talking about in this sort of dire situation? Do you know that if Pei Qian had really agreed to your decision just now, our family's reputation probably would have been ruined? Du Yuanyi tried to calm himself down again, but realized that he couldn't suppress his anger anymore, and he couldn't be bothered to suppress it anymore. He raised his hand and pointed at the entrance of the tent. Kneel down. What's making you so angry? Du Yuanrua was helped to the door by a few servants. Before he could kneel down, he saw Pei Qian walk in with a smile. Seeing Pei Qian enter, for the first time, Du Yuanrua felt that his voice was so pleasant. At least he didn't have to kneel now. Long time no see. There's nothing I can welcome you with. I can only try my best to arrange things for you. Pei Qian didn't even look at Du Yuanrua, who was standing at the door. He walked past him and walked in front of Du Yuanyi. He invited him with a smile, let's go. I asked Qian He to hunt some wild animals on the mountain. I'll try my best to be a host. Mr. Du, please come. Chapter 72. Visit You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 72. Visit Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Lu Zhe didn't go too deep into the mountain today. With a few men from Mrs. Luo's family following, he led them on the mountain path opposite the soldiers. There were fewer people, so there was naturally less trouble and they returned with a full load. Lu Zhe gave most of the prey to Mrs. Luo and the others. Anyway, there were still a few days left. He could just make a trip alone if he needed more. Lu Zhe told Lin Suisui about going up the mountain today. Lin Suisui also told him the news that the rations had arrived. Pei Qian had also arranged for Qian He to tell her to boil chicken soup. Mr. Pei has spoken. Now that we're under his command, let's endure it for the time being. Seeing that Lu Zhe didn't reply, Lin Suisui thought for a moment and reached out to tug at the corner of his shirt. She advised him in a low voice, anyway, when we reach the base, he'll go back and report. We won't see him anymore. Besides, he didn't come empty-handed. A few skins were delivered, along with pheasants and yellow sheep. I'll just treat it as payback. Knowing that Lin Suisui was worried about him, Lu Zhe turned around and looked down at the concerned girl. He smiled and comforted her calmly, I know what's important. It's fine. If Lu Zhe said that it was fine, then he really wasn't just coaxing Lin Suisui. He was clearly better at roasting meat than Lin Suisui. Lin Suisui thought that they would roast yellow sheep at night, so she went out early to find some wild vegetables and condiments that could be used for seasoning. Lu Zhe directly placed the washed and peeled yellow sheep that Qian He had sent over on the grill and began to prepare for dinner. When Pei Qian brought the Du brothers over, Lu Zhe had just turned over the roasted lamb. Qian He brought 2 servants and sent over a few jars of good wine. Without saying anything, Qian He stood by the ox cart and bowed, then lifted the wind curtain to let Pei Qian and Du Yuanrua in. Seeing the unfamiliar face that suddenly came in, Lin Suisui was obviously a little taken aback, but she only showed a little surprise and didn't lose her composure. Lu Zhe was in front. He and Lin Suisui, who had half her body blocked by him, was about to bow to Pei Qian and the Du family. Unexpectedly, Pei Qian was a step faster than them. Before they could bow, he stopped them. "It's fine. It's not a big deal. We're considered acquaintances. Although the food prepared by my people tastes good, it's quite boring to eat the same thing every day." He had been thinking about Madame Lu's chicken soup after tasting it. "An esteemed guest happened to come today, so I brought him along. Do you mind?" Lu Zhe met Pei Qian's smiling face. His expression was still as impassive as ever. "Mr. Pei, please go ahead." Du Yuanruo raised his eyebrows in disdain. Looking at the simple decorations beside the bonfire, he felt that Pei Qian was deliberately screwing with them. He was about to scold him when his brother glanced at him and his heart skipped a beat. He was so frightened that he almost fainted. "I mean, where should we sit?" Du Yuanruo, who had recovered, no longer had the courage to complain. He shrank his neck and muttered in a low voice, "We can't sit on the ground, right?" Before Du Yuanruo could finish speaking, Qian He, who was guarding at the side, had already brought people over. He sent in a few folding stools and bowed behind these guests. Without saying anything, he hurriedly retreated. "Your roasting method looks a little familiar." Du Yuanyi sat down beside Pei Qian and stared at Lu Zhe, who was roasting mutton, for a long time before saying with a smile, "I've seen it in the army before. I'm a hunter. Speaking of which, my master taught me how to roast meat." Lu Zhe didn't stop what he was doing. He pretended not to discern that Du Yuanyi was probing. "My master used to be in the army, but after returning to the countryside, he hunted for a living. He told me that the reason the army doesn't split mutton in half is that no one knows when the next battle will be fought. Therefore, if the entire mutton is roasted, even if there isn't enough time to finish roasting it, we only need to put it aside and come back to grill it. The meat inside will still be delicious." Lu Zhe's explanation was reasonable. Du Yuanyi glanced at him and didn't say anything else. However, when he saw Pei Qian take out his golden dagger, his expression changed slightly. "A man should not cook. Mr. Pei, stop." It wasn't the first time Du Yuanyi had interacted with Pei Qian. Therefore, he knew at least 30% to 40% of his preferences. This dagger of his. Lu Zhe could tell that Pei Qian was eager to try. He took the short knife beside him and handed it to Pei Qian. Pei Qian's eyes flashed with disdain, but he didn't refuse. He reached out and took the short knife, then placed the roasted mutton into the silver plate that Qian He had sent over previously. Du Yuanyi smiled and turned to look at Lin Suisui, who was watching the soup being stewed on the other side. "Other than sending over the rations, I came this time to thank you for saving my brother." Lin Suisui was slightly stunned. She didn't expect that she would be called on even though she had already hid in a corner. "You're welcome." She was just following orders. Lu Zhe didn't intend to let Lin Suisui get involved, so before she could speak, he had already spoken up for her. Du Yuanyi seemed to have said it casually. Seeing that Lu Zhe responded, he didn't harp on it anymore. Instead, he changed the topic and started chatting with Pei Qian, who was beside him. Seeing that the chicken soup in the soup jar was almost ready, Lin Suisui stood up. She walked to the door and gave instructions to Qian He before taking the opportunity to leave. She didn't go far. She went to Mrs. Luo's house, which wasn't far away. Mrs. Luo and the others had long noticed the commotion there, but since the hire.ups didn't say anything, they didn't have the courage to go over and ask. Now that Lin Suisui had arrived safely, Mrs. Luo was relieved. She reached out and pulled Lin Suisui to sit beside the bonfire. Then, she pulled a blanket from the side to drape over Lin Suisui's shoulders. Then, she lowered her voice and asked, "Are you all right?" Chapter 73. Murder Again. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Chapter 73. Murder Again. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, I'm fine. It's just that the official that sent the rations from the capital is here. Mr. Pei is welcoming him. There was actually nothing to hide, so Lin Suisui simply told Mrs. Luo the entire story. Then, she continued, I heard that a lot of food was transported this time. Even if we continue north, our lives probably won't be as difficult as before. Hearing this, Mrs. Luo finally felt relieved. She prayed for a while before she said, that's good. It's not like we haven't suffered before. However, there had to be something to look forward to. Actually, after traveling together for so many days, we can tell that although Mr. Pei is ruthless, he's capable. At least, he's hundreds or thousands of times better than the officials in our previous county office. Now that the food has been transported over, even if there's not much, it's not impossible for us to survive if we save some. Actually, everyone was discussing this topic today. Everyone said that someone had specifically sent food over from the capital, but that was just a rumor. Now that it had been confirmed, they were overjoyed. By the way, did you know that when we went up the mountain to look for wild vegetables today, for some reason, Du Wangshi suddenly lost their temper and beat up Du Miaoer and her sister after hearing Su Sanyang's words. The situation was terrifying at that time. I really didn't expect her to be so ruthless. Thinking of how Du Wangshi picked up a stone from the ground and was about to smash it on Du Miaoer's head, Mrs. Luo still felt a lingering sense of fear. Du Wangshi is already famous now, so she naturally doesn't have those previous concerns. Coupled with Du Linger's current situation, it's reasonable for her to flare up. Lin Suisui wasn't surprised to hear this. Ednel.co Su Sanyang must have said something to Du Wangshi. From this, she could more or less guess that the two sisters were not as innocent as Du Wanner had said when she came over to complain to her. However, no matter what, this was the Du family's matter and had nothing to do with her. After taking the bowl of ginger soup from Mrs. Luo, Lin Suisui lowered her head and took a sip. She felt warm all over and didn't feel that the night breeze was bone-chilling anymore. Mrs. Luo took out 2 vegetable pancakes and skewered them with branches to roast near the bonfire. As she did so, she smiled at Lin Suisui and said, from the looks of it, you definitely didn't eat anything when you came out. I'll roast 2 of the wild vegetable pancakes we made tonight. Lin Suisui thanked Mrs. Luo in a low voice, but before the cake could heat up, a scream made her hand tremble. Half a bowl of ginger soup fell to the ground. She subconsciously stood up and looked in the direction of the scream. Before she could take half a step forward, she was pulled into an embrace that smelled like wine. Don't be afraid. It's fine. Lu Zhe rushed out when he heard the scream. He only relaxed a little when he protected Lin Suisui in his arms. In an instant, Pei Qian and Du Yuanyi came out of the tarpaulin tent one after another and walked over with dark expressions. It's over there. Lin Suisui shivered in Lu Zhe's arms. Under Lu Zhe's comfort, she finally recovered a little. She pointed in a direction with trembling fingers. That was the place where the Du family had settled down. Lin Suisui remembered it very clearly. That scream was really too terrifying. Pei Qian glanced at Lin Suisui, who was still protected by Lu Zhe, and didn't ask further. He turned around and rushed in the direction of the scream. Du Yuanyi had just arrived and wasn't familiar with everything here. Therefore, he abided by the wise principle of talking and doing less while watching more. He followed Pei Qian to the scene. Although he was more or less mentally prepared, when Du Yuanyi came over and saw the scene, he was still very glad that he didn't have time to eat anything tonight. He forcefully suppressed his surging emotions, but it was obvious that Du Yuanrua, who had come with him, didn't have the willpower. After taking a look at the situation in the tent, his face couldn't help but turn pale. Du Yuanyi quickly pushed him around. The mutton and chicken soup that he had just eaten was vomited on the manservant behind him. Pei Qian frowned as he looked at the corpse in the tent. Then, he turned to the panicked people around him and asked calmly, "Whose tent is this?" "Master, this is the Su family's tent." A middle-aged man, who was barely able to maintain his composure, knelt on the ground and stammered as he explained what had just happened to Pei Qian. "We all went up the mountain today and gained a lot, so we wanted to keep a portion of it for dinner." The middle-aged man was a little reserved and afraid at first, but as soon as he spoke, he reported more articulately. "We just prepared dinner and wanted to call everyone over, but when we arrived at the Su family, where's the Su family now?" Pei Qian took a few steps forward and entered the tent. He lowered his head and carefully observed the corpse before slowly standing up. Then, he turned around and instructed Qian He, who had already rushed over, "Go and bring the Su family over." Actually, without Pei Qian's instructions, the Su family members not far away had already rushed over and knelt down. "Is there anyone in your family who hasn't come?" Pei Qian looked at the panicked Su family members on the ground and asked bluntly. The Su family was already frightened by this corpse. Now that Pei Qian was asking them so bluntly, the 7 to 8 men and women in the family only kowtowed and begged for mercy. The man who had replied previously continued respectfully, "Other than the eldest daughter of the Su family, who just fainted, everyone else is here. In that case, this corpse's surname isn't Su." Pei Qian's gaze swept across the heads of the people kneeling on the ground. After a long time, he sneered. "Heh, I really didn't expect this. There are really hidden geniuses in this refugee camp. I haven't seen such good craftsmanship in a long time. Qian He, seal the entire refugee camp. We'll investigate them one by one." Chapter 74. Little Perseverance. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Chapter 74. Little Perseverance. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Lu Zhe didn't let Lin Suisui watch the commotion that had attracted the attention of everyone in the refugee camp. After settling Lin Suisui back in the ox cart, he went over. He left quickly and came back even faster. Lin Suisui had just laid out the rabbit fur blanket when she turned around and saw Lu Zhe enter. "It's fine. Even if it's not fine, it won't affect us." Seeing Lin Suisui's eyes suddenly widen, Lu Zhe quickly comforted her gently, "We knew about it long ago. Just like you guessed, it was exposed in public." Seeing that Lin Suisui was relieved, Lu Zhe told her everything that had happened just now. Then, he said, "Pei Qian will take over the investigation. We should be careful and wait for news." Lu Zhe didn't want to get involved in this matter, so the safest way was to avoid it. Lin Suisui nodded. She shared Lu Zhe's opinion on this matter. In the past, Pei Qian alone was already difficult to deal with. Now, there was also Du Yuanyi, who didn't look easy to deal with either. "By the way, do you know the person who came today?" Lin Suisui hugged Little White as she crawled into the warm blanket. She sighed in satisfaction before asking Lu Zhe about the stranger she saw today. "You mean Du Yuanyi?" "Of course I know him." Lu Zhe nodded and introduced him to Lin Suisui in a low voice. "He's the eldest son of the Duke and the third prince's most trusted cousin. After he was born, he was personally brought up by the old Duke until he was sent to the palace to be the third prince's companion. It was said that he spent less than 10 days with his mother. Compared to Pei Qian, he's more qualified to be the future heir of a large family. He's level-headed and experienced. He's much better than his father, the current duke." "That's not right. If Du Yuanyi is really valued by the family as you said, why would he be arranged to deliver food?" Lin Suisui turned around. Although she didn't know much about the power struggles in the capital, she could still tell that something was wrong. For example, this time, Du Yuanyi came to deliver ration. If I'm not mistaken, he probably volunteered to deliver the rations. Lu Zhe took off his outerwear and lay down beside Lin Suisui. The interior of the ox cart was naturally much more spacious than the previous small tent, so it was more convenient for the two of them. You've seen Du Yuanruo's incompetence. Naturally, Pei Qian wouldn't let go of such a good opportunity. Moreover, with what we had experienced, even if Pei Qian didn't arrange anything, with the stark contrast between them, it was enough to suppress the third prince's faction. Therefore, Du Yuanyi probably came here to save the day. After a pause, Lu Zhe continued, the third prince takes after his mother, Consort De. He's hot-tempered. If this escort mission ruins his reputation because of Du Yuanruo, he won't care about brotherhood. Du Yuanruo was the beloved son of the duke's wife. If anything really happened to Du Yuanruo, the duke's wife probably wouldn't be able to live. In that case, Du Yuanyi is actually a good brother. After hearing Lu Zhe's story, Lin Suisui couldn't help but laugh. In such a family where mutual deception was normal, it was really rare to have an elder brother who took care of his younger brother. The two of them chatted for a while. There wasn't any trouble the entire night. When Lin Suisui woke up, it was already dawn. Just as Lu Zhe had expected, Pei Qian was indeed difficult to deal with. In just one night, although he had not found the real culprit who was hiding in the refugee camp, he had already deduced most of the story. Unable to escape, Lin Suisui had no choice but to face Pei Qian, who had come looking for trouble. I'm just a doctor, not a coroner. Lin Suisui sighed and looked at Pei Qian awkwardly as she tried to reason with him. You can ask me to treat illnesses and save people, but asking me to help you investigate the murder is really overestimating me. Lin Suisui's rejection was very obvious, but Pei Qian didn't give up. He only smiled and took 2 steps with his hands behind his back before looking at Lin Suisui. I know what you're thinking. You just want to protect yourself. However, if this matter isn't resolved, I won't have so many scruples. Seeing that Lin Suisui only lowered her head and didn't respond, Pei Qian waited for a while before continuing, but if Madame Lu can help, no matter what happens, I'll be able to protect your lives. What do you need me to do? Lin Suisui looked up at Pei Qian, who was standing in front of her and enticing her patiently. At this point, it was impossible for her to stay out of this. Therefore, giving in was the best choice now. Madame Lu, your medical skills are brilliant, so you must be knowledgeable and experienced. You won't panic or faint from fear over a mere corpse, right? Pei Qian raised his hand and made an inviting gesture. Please follow me to take a look at the corpse we found last night and see if you can discover anything. Lin Suisui glanced at Pei Qian, but didn't say anything. She turned around and went to the ox cart to get a mask for herself. Then, she followed Pei Qian through the refugee camp and entered the large tent that contained the corpse. There was no one else in the tent at this moment. Lin Suisui stopped at the door and didn't enter. What's wrong? Pei Qian, who had already walked to the white cloth covering the corpse, turned around and was surprised to see Lin Suisui still standing at the entrance of the tent. He smiled and beckoned to her. Come and take a look. Pei Qian's excited expression gave Lin Suisui goosebumps. She subconsciously took 2 steps back and looked at Pei Qian warily. I want to find my husband. Even if Gu Erlang comes, you'll still have to come in to do the autopsy. Pei Qian stood up straight and looked sideways at Lin Suisui with obvious menace and oppression. You definitely won't be able to escape today. I'm not trying to escape. Lin Suisui gritted her teeth. She was quite insistent on this point and didn't intend to compromise at all. If he doesn't come, even if you force me in, I won't say a word. Chapter 75. Painted Skin. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 75. Painted Skin. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Lin Suisui was persistent in this matter. Fortunately, this wasn't an urgent request. Pei Qian didn't negotiate with Lin Suisui for long. He turned around and instructed Qian He, who was guarding the door, to look for Lu Zhe. Not long after Qian He left, he rushed over with Lu Zhe. Of course, if Du Yuanyi had not followed them, the expression on Pei Qian's face would probably have been much more pleasant. I was bored, so I came over to see if there was anything I could help with. Du Yuanyi entered the tent and explained to Pei Qian with a smile. Pei Qian ignored him and looked at Lin Suisui, who had walked over with Lu Zhe and stood opposite him. How about it? If you're ready, let's begin. Yes. Lin Suisui nodded and looked down at Pei Qian's hand that was reaching for the white cloth. Seeing Lin Suisui nod, Pei Qian didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and lifted the white cloth covering the corpse. He was fast, but Lu Zhe, who was standing beside Lin Suisui, was even faster. Almost at the same time, he raised his hand to block Lin Suisui's eyes and prevented her from seeing the tragic sight. Lin Suisui's body subconsciously tensed up, but she quickly calmed down. She raised her hand and removed Lu Zhe's hand from in front of her. She could already calmly observe the female corpse in front of her. In order to prevent the corpse from rotting too quickly, there were no braziers in the tent. Looking at such a mangled corpse, even Du Yuanyi felt a little uncomfortable. However, Lin Suisui, who looked the most delicate and fragile, examined the corpse seriously with a cold gaze. I didn't expect Madame Lu to be so proficient in forensics. Du Yuanyi covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief as he looked at Lin Suisui, who was carefully examining the corpse. From Du Yuanrua and his followers, he had also heard many rumors about Madame Lu. A refugee in the refugee camp actually had medical skills that were not inferior to that of the best doctor in the empire. It wasn't that he looked down on those doctors in the civilian world, but since she had such extraordinary medical skills, why did she become a refugee? Even if her hometown encountered a disaster, it was impossible for her to fall into a situation where she had nowhere to go. This was too strange. Mr. Pei, you probably don't know that forensic science is actually related to medicine in many ways. Doctors treat illnesses and save people, so we have to understand the anatomy of the human body. Therefore, although I've never been a coroner, I can also see what a coroner can see at this moment. Since Lin Suisui had decided to come over and help Pei Qian investigate the case, she was naturally prepared to deal with doubts about her abilities. Of course, this wasn't nonsense. It was an undeniable fact. A doctor could become a rather outstanding coroner, but a coroner might not be able to become an outstanding doctor. This was what her mentor had taught her when she had just entered the medical world. Then can you tell the cause of this corpse's death? Lin Suisui's words made Du Yuanyi even more interested. Of course, he knew that Lin Suisui's explanation was the truth, but such a delicate woman was actually so calm when seeing such a terrifying corpse that even men would lose their composure over. This corpse was skinned when it was alive. Lin Suisui looked up at Du Yuanyi. It was unknown if she was doing it on purpose, but she actually asked him for help. Can I trouble Mr. Du to help me flip this corpse over? Du Yuanyi's hand that was holding the handkerchief froze. He clearly didn't expect Lin Suisui to call for his help. Aren't you anxious to know the cause of death of this female corpse? Aren't you going to help? Pei Qian, who was originally standing at the side with a straight face, revealed a rare smile and urged Du Yuanyi, who was standing beside him, with a hint of mischief. No matter how unwilling he was, Du Yuanyi could only grit his teeth and agree under Pei Qian's gloating gaze. He put away the handkerchief in his hand and took 2 steps forward to stand beside the wooden platform. What should I do? Just raise this female corpse so that I can see her back. When Du Yuanyi asked this question, Lin Suisui had already walked around the wooden platform. She squatted down and gestured for Du Yuanyi to start. Du Yuanyi suppressed his discomfort and reached out to grab the dead woman's sticky body. He slowly raised her body higher according to Lin Suisui's request. No, lift her body higher. Lin Suisui said. Her voice wasn't loud, but her request wasn't vague at all. What about now? Du Yuan's face was tense and his tone was urging. He gritted his teeth and stopped thinking about the creepy touch. As expected, the murderer cut the back of this corpse and peeled the skin off completely. Lin Suisui raised her head slightly and gestured for Pei Qian to look. Look, there are still traces of a dagger. Even if you know this, what's the use? Du Yuan couldn't take it anymore. He loosened his grip and let the female corpse lie back on the wooden platform safely. He really wanted to wash his hands now, but he was afraid that if he left, he would miss out on many things he wanted to know. Therefore, no matter how disgusted he felt, he still chose to stay. Didn't you just ask me about the cause of death of this corpse? Lin Suisui's tone was gentle as she looked up at Du Yuan seriously and replied matter-of-factly. Yes, I'm concerned about the cause of her death. What does it have to do with how she was skinned? Du Yuan took a deep breath and tried his best to calm down quickly. He had really lost his composure. Of course it does. She died of pain. Lin Suisui blinked. She really didn't understand why he had to ask such a simple question so many times. Doviko, unlike Du Yuan, Pei Qian really couldn't help but laugh. He ignored Du Yuan's dark expression and coughed softly. Then, he asked Lin Sui, why do you care so much about her losing her skin? I heard that you're the Minister of Justice. You must be knowledgeable. I wonder if you've heard of an urban legend called Painted Skin. Lin Suisui looked at Pei Qian and said calmly. Chapter 76. Showdown. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 76. Showdown. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, I've heard a little about it. It's said that the evil spirits in hell will put on human skin to disguise themselves. However, after some time, the human skin will decay. They paint their human skin into the appearance of a beautiful woman and let those who fall into their trap fall deeper and deeper until they die. As Pei Qian looked down at the female corpse on the wooden platform, he answered Lin Suisui's question. He didn't follow in Du Yuan's footsteps and ask questions that would obviously be mocked by Lin Suisui. Instead, he chose to stop at the right time. Lin Suisui glanced at Pei Qian unhappily but didn't argue too much about this small matter. She continued, I suspect that the murderer has already changed into this woman's skin and is living in the refugee camp we're in under this woman's identity. Lin Suisui was very certain. Before Pei Qian and the others could question her, she continued, previously, when I was studying medicine with my mentor once mentioned some strange things to me when he was a doctor without borders. One of them was the face-changing technique. According to him, in the barbarian tribes outside the northern border, the shaman priests they worshipped had mastered a strange technique that allowed them to change their faces and identities. Her mentor was interested in this because he had treated a patient who was severely burned. He said that the patient was a woman. When her family asked him to treat her, she was only 17. She was at the prime of youth, but she had to face the tragic fate of being disfigured. Her mentor couldn't bear to see it, so he wondered if he could find a way to restore her appearance. He became interested in the legend about the barbarians outside the northern region. In that case, your mentor has mastered this strange technique. When Du Yuan heard this, he became even more interested in Lin Suisui's mentor. If someone really mastered this strange technique, then... Of course not. Lin Suisui shook her head and replied straightforwardly, my mentor said that in order to master this strange technique, he tried his best to blend in with the northern barbarians. However, he found nothing even after 3 years. Because this strange technique was in the hands of the shaman priest. The shaman wouldn't spread this strange technique. Only the wolf guards, who protected him and were absolutely loyal to the priest, were qualified to practice this strange technique. My mentor tried his best, but he failed. In the end, he could only return empty-handed and go to the southern barbaric land to find other ways. Are you suspecting that a spy from the northern barbarians has sneaked into our refugee camp? Pei Qian was shrewd. Coupled with the information Lu Zhe had revealed to him previously, he could guess what Lin Suisui meant. I'm just making a small guess based on the current situation. As for whether the information is valuable or not, I'll have to ask you to decide yourself, Your Highness. However, there are still traces of herbs on this female corpse. Although they are very faint, I can still smell them. It's probably the smell of wolf venom grass. Lin Suisui didn't intend to hide anything about this. Using her mentor as a ruse to answer this matter was the most reasonable explanation at the moment. She had already discussed this with Lu Zhe. That it was too dangerous for that wolf guard to stay in the refugee camp. They had to find him as soon as possible. My mentor said that for this strange technique of the northern barbarians to work, the skin has to be completely peeled off. Therefore, they inject secret medicine through the gap when they peel the skin. This will make it easier to separate the skin. And one of the ingredients was wolf poison grass. Besides, if it wasn't really useful in this aspect and the murder was just for the sake of money or revenge, why go through such trouble? Wouldn't it better if the culprit secretly buried her on the spot? In that case, that person probably won't be able to hide for long before continuing to harm others. Du Yuanyi frowned. If Lin Suisui was right, this devil in human skin probably wouldn't be able to hide for long before having to kill again. After all, he didn't have the means of that evil ghost. He couldn't make that human skin last forever. Yes, because he has to find a new person to change his skin. Lin Suisui nodded. You just said that this female corpse was cut from the back. Then, we just have to find people with new injuries in the refugee camp to confirm who the murderer is. Du Yuanyi suddenly had a very good idea. What excuse will you use to investigate? How can you hide it from the murderer who sneaked into the refugee camp? If you can't hide it, a second corpse will probably appear. Pei Qian rejected Du Yuanyi's suggestion without hesitation. Because of this female corpse's appearance last night, the entire refugee camp is already in a panic. If we investigate with great fanfare, it'll terrify people even more. Things will worsen if we alarm the wolf guard hiding in the dark. Actually, it's not difficult for you to prevent that person from continuing to do evil. You just have to gather all the people in the refugee camp and prevent anyone from leaving until the investigation is over. I don't believe that person can really do evil under our noses. Seeing that Pei Qian had rejected his suggestion, Du Yuanyi was naturally indignant and immediately suggested a solution. This time, Pei Qian didn't say anything, but Lu Zhe, who had been standing beside Lin Suisui, interrupted, Mr. Pei, you mean that the death of one or two refugees here is actually not a big deal, and that what's important is finding the purpose of that wolf guard infiltrating the refugee camp. If you arrange for a big investigation now, the murderer will definitely be exposed. Then, there's naturally no need for him to continue staying. If he escapes in advance, the investigation will only help us find out the true identity of the female corpse in front of us. But what if things aren't as you guessed? Perhaps there was a conflict between the refugees in the refugee camp, and one of them accidentally committed manslaughter. After all, this is not impossible. I remember that at the end of last year, the court investigated a similar case. For that case, the motive was envy. Du Yuanyi's mind was in a mess. It wasn't only because of the murder case he had encountered as soon as he arrived, but because he felt flustered about losing control. Chapter 77. Sudden change. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 77. Sudden change. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Du Yuanyi knew very well that the main purpose of his trip was to clean up Du Yuanruo's mess. Otherwise, his bastard brother would die under the third prince's knife. Even if the third prince was on good terms with his scumbag brother, that was only possible if they didn't threaten or harm the third prince's interests. Moreover, the crown prince was still in power. Now was the critical time for the third prince and the fourth prince to compete for that position. If he really lost in front of Pei Qian, the consequences would be disastrous. The third prince wouldn't let his useless brother off the hook. So, here he was. Yes, his brother was a good for nothing. But he never expected him to be useless to this extent. A northern barbarian had actually infiltrated a small refugee camp. If this continued, the consequences would be terrifying. If his stupid brother had mentioned it in the letter he sent back to the capital, he wouldn't have only found out after he arrived, and the current situation wouldn't have caught him off guard so much. He screwed himself over by coming here. Du Yuanyi, who was already flustered, subconsciously wanted to smooth things over. As long as this matter didn't involve northern barbarian spies, things could still be controlled. But if this matter really developed further, the consequences. It was already too late for him to salvage the situation now. Pei Qian had already gained the upper hand. If Pei Qian took the opportunity to hit him when he was down, the outcome might be the end of their duke's estate. Prince Du, what are you afraid of? Pei Qian could naturally guess what Du Yuanyi was thinking. He looked disdainfully at Du Yuanyi, who was still thinking about protecting himself when the truth was already clear. He snorted and said, "You don't have to worry that I'll hit you when you're down. If you're really worried, you can leave immediately. I've previously reminded you to leave behind some rations and quickly bring your brother back to the capital. This way, you can reunite with your family before the new year. But you were unwilling and insisted on staying. Do you regret it now?" After mocking Du Yuanyi, Pei Qian turned around. He immediately changed his attitude as he said to Lu Zhe and Lin Suisui in a very gentle tone, "It's been hard on you today, Madame Lu. There's nothing else for you to do here. You guys can go back and rest." Lin Suisui bowed slightly to Pei Qian and left with Lu Zhe. Before they could walk far, they saw Du Wangshe running towards them with red eyes. Madame Lu, go over and take a look." Linger, her condition worsened. Seeing how flustered Du Wangshe was, Lin Suisui knew that she wouldn't be able to get any useful information from her. She only nodded at her and rushed towards the Du family's tent. Lin Suisui saw that outside the Du family's tent, there were already many onlookers. Du Wangshe was extremely anxious. As she cried, she rushed forward and pushed her way through the crowd, who was tiptoeing and craning their necks. The crowd moved aside and let Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe, who followed behind, enter. While she was still outside the crowd, Lin Suisui could already hear the sound of people telling her to put down the knife and calm down. There was also the sound of a woman screaming hysterically. When she passed through the crowd, she saw that Du Wanner, who had been crying for help, was being strangled by the disheveled Du Linger, whose other hand was holding a short knife. Her hand that was holding the knife was trembling, and she had already lacerated Du Wanner's neck. Not far from their feet, Du Miao was lying there unconscious with a pale face. From the shattered utensils on the ground, it was obvious what had just happened. The person who was trying her best to persuade Du Linger to put down the knife was their aunt, Madame Du Luo. However, it was obvious that Du Luo was also frightened by the scene in front of her. Not only did she fail to make Du Linger put down the knife in her hand, but she also lost control of her emotions. "Linger, don't mess around." Although Du Wangshe usually scolded Du Miao and her sister, she knew her limits. A life for a life. This was an iron law that had never changed since ancient times. She stopped Du Linger now not because she cared about Du Miao and her sister, but because she didn't want her daughter to get the death penalty. "If you have any grievances or woes, just tell me. I'll help you, okay? Don't take it too hard. Think about it. If anything happens to you, what will I do? Linger, listen to me. Put down the knife first. Let's talk it out, okay?" Du Wangshe was sweating from anxiety, but she didn't wipe her sweat. She carefully took a few steps closer, but she had to quickly stop and retreat because of Du Linger's scream. However, Her eyes never left Du Linger. Say it. What's there to say? Even if I say it, can you help me? These two bitches have ruined my reputation. They ruined my life. Tears streamed down Du Linger's face. As she spoke, she used the blade to slash Du Wanner's neck twice. Although the slashes were not deep, they were enough to make Du Wanner scream in pain. However, Du Linger ignored them at this moment. Instead, she looked at Du Wangsher and complained tearfully, I told them that day that I was going to look for Song Yu, but they framed me. If Song Yu hadn't come over to tell me today, I would have been kept in the dark. They slandered me and ruined my reputation. They even said that I'd gone crazy. It's all their fault. They're two bitches. Mother, you don't know. Just as Du Linger was about to say something else as she looked at Du Miaoer, who was lying on the ground, a flying knife suddenly shot through the tent from behind and pierced her neck. All of this happened too quickly and suddenly. Du Wanner, who had been strangled by Du Linger and thought that she was doomed, was instantly sprayed with blood. Although she was temporarily saved, she was so frightened that she screamed. Lu Zhe moved very quickly. When Du Linger was pierced by the flying dagger, he had already rushed forward, but he was still too late. Chapter 78. Pei Qian's Opponent. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Chapter 78. Pei Qian's Opponent. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. When a murder happened in the refugee camp again, Pei Qian rushed over immediately, but Du Linger was already dead. Du Wanner, who was so frightened that she was screaming, was knocked out by Qian He, who arrived first. At this moment it was better for her to be unconscious than awake. Lin Suisui stayed close to Lu Zhe. The two of them avoided the soldiers who came to investigate and stood at the side as they looked at the busy crowd in front of them. Only when Pei Qian and Du Yuanyi strode over did Lin Suisui look away and move from the crowd to the area less than a foot in front of her. She looked exceptionally obedient and respectful. What's going on? Why are you guys here? Du Yuanyi frowned. Before Pei Qian could ask, he had already rushed over and questioned Lu Zhe, who was behind Lin Suisui. Du Linger was mentally unstable previously. Her mother invited me over to treat her. On our way back today, her mother rushed over to look for me and said that her daughter was unwell. She asked me to come over and take a look. Lu Zhe wanted to speak, but Lin Suisui beat him to it. She looked up slightly as she explained clearly, not long after we arrived, someone attacked from behind the tent and killed Du Linger. I chased after him, but unfortunately, I was too slow and didn't see who the murderer was. Lu Zhe continued to elaborate. Du Yuanyi stared at Lu Zhe and Lin Suisui for a long time. He knew that it was meaningless to pester them anymore, so he turned around to look at Pei Qian. Pei Qian had already entered the tent to check the situation inside. After Pei Qian checked the situation inside, he came out and saw Du Yuanyi's angry gaze. He raised his eyebrows and said in a breezy tone, "What's wrong? Someone just died, so you can't take it anymore." Du Yuanyi didn't say anything. He turned around and strode away. Seeing Du Yuanyi leave, Pei Qian didn't ask him to stay. He slowly walked to Lin Suisui. Because he had also listened to Lin Suisui's explanation to Du Yuanyi previously, he didn't want to ask again. Moreover, even if he asked, he might not get the answer he wanted. This isn't a place to ask questions. You guys should go back first. We'll talk about it another day. As Pei Qian mentioned this suggestion to Lu Zhe and Lin Suisui, he turned to give Qian He a look. Without needing him to say anything, Qian He had already arranged for people to drive out the refugees who were still coming over. Taking advantage of this chaos, Lu Zhe protected Lin Suisui and disappeared from Pei Qian's sight. Song Yu. Lin Suisui suppressed her voice and quickly told Lu Zhe the information she had just obtained from Du Linger's incoherent words. Previously, when Du Wanner came to beg me, she said that Du Linger was going to look for her lover that day. But Du Linger's attitude and her words today disproved Du Miao's previous words. She said that she went to look for Song Yu. At that time, everyone was paying attention to the blade that Du Linger was pressing against Du Wanner's throat. As for Du Linger's incoherent rants, probably not many people had listened carefully. Lu Zhe nodded and raised his hand to help Lin Suisui lift the curtain and let her in. Then, he followed her into the small shelter. She placed the dry firewood beside her on the fire. In a few seconds, the weak fire immediately lit up. The warmth spread over, and Lin Suisui finally relaxed a little. She knew that she had been too nervous this time. However, no one could remain indifferent when facing death at such a close distance. This time, the murderer's target was Du Linger. What if she was his target next time? Facing the murderer who had directly attacked her previously, she could still resist and protect herself. But now, facing a murderer lurking in the dark, what could she do to defend herself? She had almost no way out. If we assume that the murderer is the wolf guard who sneaked into the refugee camp, since he took the risk of being exposed to kill Du Linger, what secret did Du Linger know that made him take such a risk? Lu Zhe poured a bowl of soup from the pot beside him and handed it to Lin Suisui as he talked to her about today's shocking incident. Lin Suisui took the soup bowl from Lu Zhe and took 2 sips before looking up at Lu Zhe as she whispered, "Du Yuanyi can't be trusted." Today's interaction made her notice the difference between Du Yuanyi and Pei Qian almost immediately. In the face of such a serious matter that involved life and death, Pei Qian was clearly much more reliable than Du Yuanyi, who only wanted to protect himself. Du Yuanyi has the Duke's estate backing him. Lu Zhe smiled and said in an extremely soft voice, "As for Pei Qian, he is willing to watch as the Ningyuan Marquis family is wiped out." Lin Suisui looked up at Lu Zhe in shock. When Pei Qian handles things, it's never about whether or not he can do it, but if he wants to or not. Compared to Lin Suisui, Lu Zhe clearly knew these nobles better. He seemed to have realized something and was silent for a moment before continuing. Pei Qian's mother was the second madam of Count Yongyi's estate. The first madam's wedding into the Count Yongyi's estate, as well as the second madam's marriage into the Marquis Ning Yuan estate, were spectacular events. Later on, the second madam, then wife of Marquis Ning Yuan, died during childbirth after giving birth to a son. The first madam anxiously arranged for the imperial physicians to investigate. Later on, 2 concubines were sent from Marquis Ning Yuan's residence to the manor. Later on, the first madam had a miscarriage in the palace and was depressed for a long time. Count Yongyi was also punished with exile because of a murder case. After a few years, when the 4th prince began to choose his followers, news of Pei Qian came. It was only after Pei Qian entered the palace that the capital found out that Marquis Ning Yuan had such a talented heir. Lu Zhe's recount was very vague, but the information he revealed was enough to make people shudder. Whether it was Pei Qian's mother, his aunt who married into the palace, or even the demise of Count Yongyi's entire family, they were definitely not as simple as he said. It said that Pei Qian was taken away by his grandfather, Marquis Ning Yuan, when he was 4 years old. As for how his life was before that, no one knows. I once arranged for someone to investigate, but they found nothing. Lu Zhe reached out and took the empty bowl from Lin Suisui's hand as he said, "I believe those who knew about his past must have been cremated already." Chapter 79. The Truth. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Chapter 79. The Truth. Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Du Linger's murder had caused quite a commotion at that time, but after nightfall, things finally calmed down, allowing most of the refugees in the refugee camp to have some rest. After Lin Suisui tidied up, she bumped into Mrs. Luo, who was rushing over. The 2 sisters from the Du family were suddenly sent away by Mr. Pei last night. When Mrs. Luo saw Lin Suisui, she immediately told her everything that had happened last night. They came very suddenly, then gagged everyone from the Du family and took them away silently. The reason I knew was that a woman who lived next door to them had come over this morning and told me. She said that she was terrified. She said that those people captured them as soon as they came over. Originally, there was a bold person from the Du family who struggled, but in the end, those people gave them 2 slaps. Lun Yang, what do you think the Du family? I don't know. Lin Suisui shook her head gently. In any case, there has been a lot of trouble in the refugee camp recently. It's best to tell everyone in your family to be careful and not wander around these few days. This is the best way to protect ourselves. Mrs. Luo strongly agreed with Lin Suisui's words. She nodded repeatedly. Thinking of her daughter who was clamoring to go out, she turned around and rushed back. On the other side, Lin Suisui went back and had a simple breakfast. Then, she saw Lu Zhe return with 2 live fish. She stood and went forward to help, but Lu Zhe stopped her. Don't wet your clothes. I'll go to the side to parch them first before coming back to talk. Lu Zhe dealt with the fish and had just sat down when he saw the curtain beside him move. Qian he squeezed in with a smile and bowed to them as he said politely, Mr. Pei invites the 2 of you over. The place Pei Qian invited them to this time was beyond Lin Suisui's expectations. It wasn't the big tent that he had always invited them to, but on a stone beach by the river outside the refugee camp. Pei Qian, wearing a simple fur-collared cloak with pine and crane patterns, was sitting by the bonfire. He was brewing tea on the table. Seeing Lin Suisui and the others come over, Pei Qian only raised his eyes slightly and gestured for them to sit on the short stool that had been prepared by the bonfire. We won't drink today. I'll treat you guys to tea. The water in the small red clay stove beside Pei Qian had already boiled. When he was brewing tea, he gave off a sense of elegance. After Lin Suisui took the teacup from Qian He, she held the expensive tea set in a daze. She hesitated for a moment before taking a sip. The tea was aromatic and full-flavored. Still. How is it? This tea was produced by my mother on a farm on Wui Mountain. There are only 2 tea trees left on the cliff. Very few are sent to me every year. Along the way, this was the first time I've thought of opening it. Pei Qian swirled the teacup in his hand and he sounded pretty proud. However, both Lu Zhe and Lin Suisui, who were sitting beside him, had lukewarm reactions. When Lin Suisui heard Pei Qian's words, she picked up the teacup and continued to drink. In the end, she frowned and put it down in embarrassment. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I'm not used to drinking this. You've never drunk tea before. Pei Qian was clearly a little surprised. He glanced at the teacup in Lin Suisui's hand that was still half full of tea. He was still a little suspicious. We country bumpkins drink big-leaved herbal tea. There's a common name for it. 3 pins, because we only need 3 or 4 leaves to make a big pot. When the farmers are busy, they bring it to the fields to quench their thirst. Lin Suisui's answer seemed very convincing. In the face of Pei Qian's almost omnipresent probing, she could only be extremely careful. If she wasn't careful, she would most likely fall into his trap. I thought that you might like tea since you treat patients. Pei Qian laughed. He didn't say that he believed Lin Suisui's explanation. Of course, he didn't say that he didn't believe it either. To be honest, I really can't tell the difference between tea. Lin Suisui looked at Pei Qian apologetically. My mentor said that my tongue can probably only discern the difference in medicine. As for tea, it's fine as long as it can give the water I drink some flavor. No matter how expensive the tea is, it's a waste to let me taste it. Alright, let's get down to business. Pei Qian's gaze landed on the teacup in Lu Zhe's hand that had not been touched at all. He looked away after a moment and didn't continue to pester them. I should have asked you about the situation when something happened to that girl from the Du family yesterday. However, you guys also must have seen that there were too many people around at that time, so it wasn't convenient to ask. At night, I asked Qian He to call the Du family back for questioning. The others from the Du family are fine, but the two girls from the Du family haven't told the truth from the beginning to the end. Pei Qian explained everything that had happened previously. Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe didn't interrupt him. Pei Qian continued, I had no choice but to use some other methods. This morning, I finally sorted things out. Do you remember when Du Ling'er was kicked by me that day? From what the two girls said, Du Ling'er wanted to go to the Song family to talk to the second daughter of the Song family that day. However, Du Wan'er mentioned that Song Yu had ulterior motives and seemed to have feelings for her lover. Lo Du Ling'er was enraged and went to ask Song Yu. However, Du Wan'er said that Song Yu wasn't in the Song family at that time, but with her lover. You've also experienced Du Ling'er's temper, so she naturally went wherever Du Wan'er pointed. Seeing that Du Ling'er had believed them and was heading in the direction they were pointing, Du Wan'er and her sister naturally wanted to follow her. They had originally planned to use this as an excuse to make Du Ling'er and Song Yu fall out with each other over that lover. The more things blew up, the better. This way, Du Ling'er's reputation would be completely ruined, and they could use this opportunity to get revenge. However, to their surprise, they had only taken 2 steps in the direction when Du Ling'er rushed out from behind the bushes like a lunatic. Along the way, she even pushed Du Miao, making her fall and almost disfiguring her face. Chapter 80. Shadow. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 80. Shadow Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations. Pei Qian explained the entire matter in detail, but there was still something that couldn't be explained. Then, how did Du Ling'er disturb you? Lin Suisui raised her head slightly and asked. If this entire matter was just internal strife between the Du sisters, then why did Du Ling'er appear in their tent in the end and bump into Pei Qian, who happened to be there? How could he explain this? It was a coincidence for Du Ling'er, but not me. Pei Qian put down the teacup in his hand and replied bluntly, I was actually looking for Wu Lu and the others. Wu Lu was Pei Qian's man, but the person called Lu Er, whom he and Zhao San were guarding, was the sergeant who had escaped from the northern military camp and was secretly protected by Pei Qian. I had something to ask them that day, but I couldn't seem familiar with those 3 people on the surface, so the best way was to meet them here under the guise of meeting Gu Erlang. However, I didn't expect to see Du Ling'er, who rushed here in a panic. If that was the case, it made sense. However, the problem wasn't why Du Ling'er had appeared in front of Pei Qian, but what she had seen before she went there. Yesterday, when you saw that skinned corpse, you were not too surprised. It even seemed as if you had expected it. So, do you two know something? I'm not doubting what you said yesterday about the story your mentor told you, but did you see other similar corpses before yesterday? Pei Qian picked up the kettle on the small red clay stove and slowly poured himself another cup of tea. Then, he turned around and looked at Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe. On the night Du Ling'er was kicked by you, I went to the stream to wash the cooking utensils and smelled blood. Lu Zhe didn't mention Lin Suisui. He calmly confessed to Pei Qian about seeing the corpse that night. There was a layer of loose soil. I dug the corpse up, then took a look before burying it again. Why didn't you say so at that time? Pei Qian stared at Lu Zhe and said, You're not someone who's cowardly and afraid of trouble. If I were alone, I wouldn't have been afraid, but I wasn't alone. On this northern expedition, we've encountered many things, and each one was more troublesome and dangerous than the last. We have some unique skills, but we're just ordinary villagers. We shouldn't interfere in or know about those things. I just want to reach the base safely. I don't want any unnecessary trouble. Lu Zhe's attitude changed drastically. The helplessness from the release of pent-up emotions that had been suppressed for a long time increased the credibility of his words. He looked at Pei Qian with a hint of cruelty. We haven't slacked off or shirked from the tasks you've been assigning us. It's not because we're not good at those tasks you've been giving us. It's because we just want to survive. You have many capable soldiers and generals, so there's no need to trouble our family for everything. My wife knows medicine, but in all these years, she had never seen such a gory scene. But because of you, even though she trembled in fear, she still endured it and accepted the task. We're not as indestructible as you think. We really just want to survive. Lu Zhe's sudden outburst not only shocked Pei Qian, but also surprised Lin Suisui, who was sitting beside him. His unexpected move was perfect for this moment. But would Pei Qian believe it? Gu Erlang, you've misunderstood. I don't mean anything else. I just want the capable ones to do more work. Everyone in the refugee camp, including me, is trying to survive. In response to Lu Zhe's touch words, Pei Qian spoke with understanding. He sighed and continued, "Are you also wondering why an elite wolf guard under the barbarian shaman would appear in our refugee camp? You have to know that these wolf guards have been carefully selected and trained since they were young. Any one of them is a powerhouse who can fight 100 people alone. They're here for Lu Er." Lin Suisui thought for a moment. It seemed that there were only two things that could connect their refugee camp to the northern barbarians. Firstly, they were the first to discover that some northern barbarians had colluded with the soldiers of the refugee camp to sell them, the refugees, as slaves. However, to put it bluntly, this was just a matter of slightly less income for those in high positions. There was no need to mobilize the wolf guards. The other thing was that they had saved Lu Er. Lu Er had evidence that the general in the north had conspired with the barbarians. If the northern barbarians planned to quietly embezzle at the borders of the empire, this news couldn't be leaked. If this evidence was really sent back to the imperial court and investigated further, the northern barbarian spy network that developed in the empire over the years might suffer a destructive blow. This was a nightmare that the northern barbarians feared and couldn't accept. Smart. Pei Qian nodded. A smile appeared on his face. The northern barbarians received this news and sent a wolf guard to infiltrate the refugee camp to investigate the situation. But is there a need to make this matter so complicated? They can attack us directly if they have doubts about the refugee camp. Wouldn't it be better to kill 1,000 innocent people than let one go? Lin Suisui still couldn't figure it out. According to the northern barbarians' way of doing things, it was impossible for them to be so discreet. First, they can't be sure if Lu Er is hiding in the refugee camp. If they directly eliminate the refugees at this time, and Lu Er isn't in the refugee camp, they will be exposed and become targets for the imperial court. Secondly, even if they can confirm that Lu Er was hiding in the refugee camp, they wouldn't slaughter everyone in the camp so openly. The reason is the same. They can't, and don't dare to, expose themselves. If they slaughter the entire refugee camp, it will definitely attract the attention of the imperial court. Once the imperial court sends people to investigate this matter, everything that the northern barbarians have been planning all these years will probably be ruined.